Ethan had always been a man of the mountains, a solitary figure carved from the rugged terrain he called home. His life was measured by the rising and setting of the sun, the rhythm of the seasons, and the work his hands could coax from the stubborn earth. Love, in his mind, was an unnecessary complication, a luxury that soft people indulged in while he focused on survival and duty. So when his family demanded he marry to secure the future of the homestead, he agreed with a stoicism that surprised even himself, expecting nothing more than a woman to share his roof, tend to his home, and abide by the unspoken rules of the mountain. He imagined a life as dull and quiet as the snow-laden winters he had endured alone, certain that companionship was a burden, not a blessing. Yet, as he waited on the worn porch of his cabin, listening to the wind whip through the pines, his anticipation was tinged with unease. He had built his walls high, and the thought of someone breaching them, even politely, unsettled him more than he cared to admit. When the carriage finally appeared, carrying his bride, Ethan caught his first glimpse of Clara, a woman whose presence seemed to fill the air with warmth he hadn't known he was missing. She stepped down with a grace that contrasted sharply with his rough edges, her eyes bright with intelligence and curiosity, her smile unshaken by the long journey. In that instant, the assumptions he had clung to of a lifeless, dutiful marriage began to falter. Clara spoke with ease, laughing softly at his awkward greeting, her voice carrying over the wind like sunlight through fog. Ethan found himself both irritated and fascinated, unable to reconcile the flutter in his chest with the cold logic he had so long trusted. As she moved through the cabin, inspecting the space with respectful interest, she left traces of herself behind, not just in the footprints on the floor or the scent of her travel-worn cloak, but in the stirrings of something unfamiliar in him, curiosity, and perhaps the faintest hint of hope. The mountains, which had always echoed only with his solitude, now seemed alive with possibility. That night, as the fire crackled and shadows danced along the walls, Ethan sat in silent contemplation, realizing that this marriage, which he had once viewed as a mere obligation, might become something entirely different. For the first time in his life, he wondered not what he could endure, but what he might gain, and the thought both frightened and thrilled him in equal measure. Clara's first morning in the mountains was a collision of wonder and challenge, a world entirely unlike the valley she had left behind. She awoke to the crisp pine-scented air and the pale golden light spilling over jagged peaks, and for a moment she simply stood at the edge of the cabin porch, drinking in the vastness that seemed to stretch infinitely in every direction. The silence was both humbling and intoxicating. No carriage wheels rattling on stone, no neighbors' chatter drifting through the streets, only the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant call of a hawk. She had been warned that Ethan, her husband, was a man of few words and fewer emotions, yet she felt no fear. Instead, a quiet curiosity stirred within her, mingled with a spark of defiance. She would not be a passive occupant of this marriage, no matter the expectations placed upon her. When Ethan appeared, his face set in the habitual sternness that had become second nature to him. She met his gaze with steady eyes, offering a polite smile. He regarded her coolly, as though measuring her worth, and Clara resisted the urge to flinch under his scrutiny. Instead, she spoke of the journey, the valley, and the little things she had noticed along the road, her voice carrying warmth and intelligence that seemed almost foreign in the shadowed cabin. Ethan grunted occasionally, the closest he came to acknowledgement, yet he could not hide the subtle shift in his posture as he listened. Over the next days, Clara set about making herself useful, learning the rhythms of the mountain life with patience and determination. She chopped wood under Ethan's watchful eye, tended the small garden, and even attempted to help with the animals, her laughter ringing out when she fumbled, breaking the tense quiet of the cabin. At first, Ethan was exasperated by her energy, dismissing it as "Navit," yet he could not deny the effect she had. The house, once merely shelter, began to feel alive. There was a spark in her questions, a light in her gaze, and a gentle persistence that slowly crept under his defenses. By the end of her first week, Ethan found himself noticing the way she moved through the cabin, the way she paused to watch the sunrise, and the ease with which she adapted without losing herself. Something unfamiliar and unbidden began to take root in his chest: respect, admiration, and perhaps, though he would never admit it aloud, the first whisper of longing. Clara had arrived not just as his bride, but as a presence that would challenge his solitude and begin to unravel the walls he had spent a lifetime building. Life in the cabin settled into a rhythm, but the ease of shared space did not mean harmony. Ethan and Clara quickly discovered that their worlds were vastly different, and the collision of habits, temperaments, and expectations sparked friction almost daily. Ethan, who had lived years in rigid solitude, was used to doing everything on his own terms. Meals, cooked at precise times. Tools arranged just so, and silence reigning whenever he chose. Clara, on the other hand, carried the energy of a life surrounded by people and conversation. A curiosity that demanded engagement and questioning. She would rearrange the cabin to make it feel warmer, challenge him on why certain tasks were done a certain way, or ask questions that forced him to explain decisions he had never considered worth mentioning. At first, Ethan met her insistence with irritation, brushing off her attempts to change things as naive or unnecessary. But the truth gnawed at him. Her persistence, her laughter, and the way she seemed unafraid of his temper unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Arguments flared over trivial matters. She insisted on mending clothes her way. He stubbornly refused. She wanted to plant a flower garden near the cabin. He argued it would attract animals. She suggested small improvements for comfort. He resisted any change to tradition. And yet, amid the clashes, there were fleeting moments of connection. Ethan found himself reluctantly appreciating her insight when a solution she proposed made life easier, or noticing the thoughtful way she handled the animals, or the careful precision of her handiwork. Clara, too, began to see glimpses of the man behind the mountain, the gentleness in the way he handled his dog, the dedication to the land, the quiet strength in his hands that could move mountains, literally and figuratively. Slowly, the friction began to soften into a push-and-pull dance, one that was uncomfortable but electric. Each argument left a residue of tension, yes, but also a lingering awareness of each other's presence and importance. For the first time, Ethan felt that life with another person could be more than mere duty. Clara's very existence in his home was teaching him patience, humility, and curiosity. And though he would never admit it aloud, he found himself waiting for her voice, noticing the tilt of her head, the way she smiled when she thought no one was watching. The walls he had built around his heart began to quiver, not yet cracking, but undeniably shaken by the arrival of a woman who refused to simply fit into his solitary, ordered life and, perhaps he feared, was changing him in ways he could not control. As the days passed, the tension between Ethan and Clara began to yield to quieter, more tender moments, subtle signs that the walls around his heart were weakening. It was in the small, almost accidental gestures that Ethan first noticed the change, a gentle hand brushing flour from her cheek as she helped him bake bread, the way she instinctively knew how to soothe the animals, or the soft hum of a tune she would sing while tending the garden. At first, he tried to ignore the effect these moments had on him, clinging to his belief that a marriage was a duty, nothing more. But each shared task, each quiet evening by the fire, chipped away at his resolve. Clara's curiosity about the mountains often led them on walks together, through the forest, or along hidden streams, her enthusiasm contagious even when he pretended indifference. She would point out a cluster of wildflowers, comment on the flight of a hawk, or ask questions about the land that required him to speak in ways he hadn't. 4 years unlocking a part of himself he thought long buried. In return, Ethan began showing her his world, the hidden trails only he knew, the best spots to fish in the stream, the secret hollows where wild berries grew. Clara listened, laughed, and sometimes teased him, and though he would never admit it, he cherished her presence beside him. Slowly, the mountain, which had once echoed only with his solitude, began to feel warmer, infused with life and color he hadn't known he missed. One evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset behind the peaks, Clara leaned against his shoulder, her warmth pressing against him, and for the first time Ethan allowed himself to relax completely in another person's company. He didn't speak. Words weren't necessary. The silence was a shared comfort, a tacit acknowledgement that the space between them had shifted. He began to anticipate her questions, her laughter, her small acts of kindness, and he found himself thinking of her even when she wasn't there. It was the quiet, ordinary moments, sharing meals, mending clothes side by side, walking in the woods, that began to bind them together, laying the foundation for something neither had expected, companionship that hinted at love. And though Ethan still fought against it, deep down he knew that Clara's arrival had already changed the shape of his life, and that the mountain man who had once welcomed only solitude was slowly, irrevocably, opening his heart to another. The mountain had always been Ethan's domain, predictable in its challenges and familiar in its dangers. But one stormy afternoon reminded him just how unforgiving it could be and how dependent he had become on Clara. Dark clouds rolled over the peaks with alarming speed, the wind howling through the trees as rain began to lash against the cabin. Ethan had gone out to check on the livestock when the first drops fell, and he quickly realized the storm was far stronger than any he had anticipated. The paths became slick and treacherous, the rivers swelled with rushing water, and the sharp scent of impending danger filled the air. Panic flickered in his mind, not for himself, but for Clara, who was still inside the cabin, unaware of the rising threat. He rushed back, finding her standing at the doorway, peering into the grey tempest with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Without hesitation, she had begun securing the animals and gathering firewood, refusing to hide or panic. Ethan barked instructions, his voice sharp with urgency, but she moved with calm efficiency, anticipating his commands and acting decisively. Together, they battled the storm, hauling feed to the animals, reinforcing the cabin shutters, and guiding frightened livestock to safety. Each second demanded coordination and trust, leaving no room for ego or resentment. It was during these intense hours that Ethan saw Clara in a light he had never imagined. Fearless, resourceful, and unflinchingly brave, she met the torrent of rain and wind with steady hands and unwavering resolve, her spirit refusing to yield to fear. In the quiet moments between tasks, when the rain softened briefly, he found himself watching her, feeling a surge of admiration, and something far deeper gratitude, awe, and a protective instinct that startled him. By the time the storm finally passed, leaving a hushed, dripping world in its wake, Ethan realized he could no longer view Clara as merely a wife by obligation. She had proven herself not only capable, but indispensable. Someone whose courage and heart matched, even complemented, his own. That night, as they huddled near the fire, dripping and exhausted, Ethan felt a shift in his soul. The mountain that had once been his fortress of solitude now felt alive with their shared experience, and he understood. Perhaps for the first time that love could emerge, not in quiet comfort, but in the storm forged in trust, respect, and the undeniable thrill of facing the world together. Clara had not only survived the tempest, she had transformed it into a revelation, shattering the expectations Ethan had held for his life and marriage, leaving him with a new, unspoken truth. He was beginning to love. The days following the storm brought a new rhythm to the cabin, one imbued with a quiet intimacy neither Ethan nor Clara had anticipated. The adrenaline of survival had faded, leaving behind a lingering closeness that made the air between them heavier, charged with unspoken thoughts and feelings. Ethan, who had always been a man of few words, found himself restless with the emotions he could not name, struggling to reconcile the tenderness he felt with the walls he had built around his heart. He caught himself watching Clara as she moved through the cabin, noticing the way sunlight caught her hair, the curve of her smile when she hummed while cooking, the gentle patience in her hands as she cared for the animals. Each observation made his chest tighten with a strange, unfamiliar longing. Clara, too, felt the shift, sensing the hesitation, the flickers of vulnerability in his usually stoic eyes. One evening, under a sky blanketed with stars and a moon casting silver light over the snow-dusted peaks, Ethan finally broke the silence. He gestured to the fire, then to the vast mountains beyond, and in his rough, uneven voice, admitted the truth he had long denied, that he had underestimated her, that her courage and warmth had changed the way he saw the world. And though the words caught in his throat that she had begun to occupy a space in his heart he never thought possible. Clara listened quietly, her own eyes shimmering with emotion, before reaching for his hand, reassuring him without words that she had felt the same. She confessed the fear she had carried since her arrival, that she would only ever be tolerated, not loved, that her laughter and spirit might annoy him rather than endear her. Ethan squeezed her hand, the weight of his silence finally giving way to something tender, acknowledging not only her fears but his own vulnerability. In that moment the boundaries between them dissolved, and for the first time, they faced each other as equals, as partners not bound merely by duty but by the recognition of shared hearts and mutual respect. It was a confession born not of passion alone, but of understanding, of trust earned through storm and hardship, and of a bond forged in both challenge and quiet companionship. That night, as the fire burned low and the mountains slept under a blanket of stars, Ethan allowed himself to hope not just for their marriage, but for a future neither had dared to imagine. One where love was no longer an obligation, but a choice, a promise, and a shared journey that had already begun in the quiet, brave moments they had lived together. With the confessions of their hearts behind them, Ethan and Clara began to build a life together that was as much about partnership as it was about love. The cabin, once a place of solitude and rigid routines, now hummed with laughter, conversation, and shared purpose. Each day brought small rituals that strengthened their bond. Mornings spent tending the animals side by side. Afternoons in the garden planting vegetables and wildflowers. Evenings by the fire, sharing stories from their pasts and dreams for the future. Clara's curiosity and energy breathed new life into the cabin, while Ethan's steadfastness and knowledge of the mountain grounded her, teaching her the rhythms and secrets of a world she had never known. They discovered that love did not have to be declared in grand gestures. It lived in the simple things. The careful way Ethan would place a blanket over Clara when she fell asleep by the fire. The way she prepared his favorite meals without being asked. The quiet moments when they watched the stars stretch across the night sky, content in each other's presence. Conflicts still arose, of course, as old habits and stubbornness sometimes clashed, but these were no longer threats to their bond. They became opportunities for compromise, understanding, and growth. Through shared labor and mutual respect, Ethan found joy in seeing Clara flourish, and she, in turn, took pride in helping him embrace a life richer than the one he had known alone. Even the mountains themselves seemed transformed, less a place of isolation than a home that belonged to them both, filled with the echoes of their laughter and the imprint of their joined efforts. Slowly, the neighbors and travelers, who occasionally crossed paths with the mountain man and his bride, began to notice the changes. Well, there was warmth in Ethan, a softness in his words, and a readiness to welcome Clara's influence in ways he would never have permitted before. Together, they dreamed of the future, planning improvements to the cabin, imagining a larger garden, and talking about the possibility of a family. Each step forward was deliberate, yet natural, the weaving of two lives into one without losing the essence of either. What had begun as an obligatory marriage had grown into a partnership rooted in trust, respect, and a deep, abiding love. By embracing each other fully, flaws and all, Ethan and Clara discovered that a life built together could be not only sustaining but transformative, a reminder that love, when nurtured patiently and honestly, could turn even the harshest, loneliest mountains into a place of warmth, belonging, and enduring happiness. By the time the first snow of winter dusted the peaks and valleys, Ethan and Clara's marriage had been transformed beyond recognition. What had begun as a union of obligation had blossomed into a love that neither had anticipated. A bond forged through storms, shared labor, laughter, and quiet evenings by the fire. The cabin, once a place of solitude and rigid routine, now radiated warmth and life, echoing with their voices, footsteps, and the small, cherished rituals they had created together. Ethan, the stoic mountain man who had believed he needed no one, found his days filled with anticipation for Clara's presence, her laughter, and even her teasing, which he now welcomed with a smile rather than a scowl. Clara, who had arrived with courage and curiosity, had not only adapted to the mountain life, but had reshaped it, bringing color, softness, and joy to a world Ethan had thought unchangeable. Together, they faced each day as partners, supporting one another, sharing responsibilities, and dreaming together, whether tending the animals, expanding the garden, or simply sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the peaks in gold and crimson. Their love was no longer tentative or unspoken. It was evident in gestures large and small, in mutual respect, and in the deep trust that had grown between them. Even the surrounding mountains seemed to acknowledge the transformation, their harsh edges softened by the warmth of home and hearth that Ethan and Clara had built together. They had learned that love was not simply a feeling, but a choice made every day through patience, understanding, and the willingness to open one's heart fully. As they sat together that evening, wrapped in a shared blanket, and listening to the wind rustle the pines outside, Ethan glanced at Clara with a tenderness he had never known he was capable of, and she returned his gaze with a quiet certainty that they were exactly where they belonged. Their marriage, once a duty to be endured, had become a sanctuary of love, partnership, and possibility, a life neither had expected but both cherished deeply. In that moment, Ethan understood with full clarity that Clara had not only changed his expectations, she had changed his life. And together they would face whatever the mountains and life might bring, side by side, hearts intertwined stronger than either could have been alone.